When my kids told me they were too busy to come to my birthday dinner, I sat at my own kitchen table and smiled like I had never smiled before. I pushed back the chair I had refinished with my own hands, stood up, walked to the shelf where the keys to the vacation house hung, and made a call. In 3 simple steps, I canceled the automatic transfer that had been paying the taxes and the small mortgage on that little place by the lake. By the end of the month, the utilities would be cut, and the calendar of weekend plans they treated like a given would be empty. And that was only the beginning. Before I go on, if you like real stories where someone stands up and takes back what is theirs, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. The living room still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and the cardboard cake box was open on the counter with a half-eaten slice that tasted like stale frosting. The clock above the sink ticked loud and implacable. My daughter Sarah called from a coffee shop, and her voice had that practiced distance people use when they mean no. She said, "Dad, we are sorry, but we are slammed this weekend." I said, "This is my birthday." She laughed the way people laugh when they are deciding to hurt someone and said, "We are adults now. We have plans with Mark and his family." I could hear chairs scraping, a barista calling out an order, someone laughing too loud behind her. I asked, "So you will not come?" She answered, "We are too busy to make it." I felt the rim of the counter under my palms as if it might hold me up. I remembered the nights I painted those windows, the summers I drove up with groceries, the Sundays I fixed the leaky porch light for them. I told her calmly, "Fine, be busy. I will do something about the house you treat like a promise." She said nothing and hung up. You will not believe what I did next, but first let me explain who I am and how I got to this table. My backstory is long but important. I grew up in a small town where people kept secrets in cupboards and paid for things with favors. My mother worked 2 jobs and my father left when I was young. I learned early that nothing was owed to me unless I earned it. I married young to someone kind who wanted stability. I became an electrician and later a supervisor, which gave me just enough to buy that old vacation house with a loan and a lot of patience. When the kids were born, I took extra shifts, fixed roofs, and refinished floors. I remember Emily arriving home for the first time, smelling of hospital disinfectant, and the way Sarah held her like she would never let go. Those years taught me how to count and stretch money, and how to make a small income feel like a safety net. Then came the accident that took my wife's job and half our savings. We sold a second car, picked up more shifts, and I wrote a check to cover a medical bill that should have been insurance. I kept every receipt. I taped invoices inside a shoebox and labeled each envelope with dates and numbers, because that shoebox became my proof that we had never been careless with what I called our promises. There were nights I slept in a recliner because my back hurt from climbing ladders, and my kids thought I was humming because I liked it. The truth was, I was tired and saving. I never imagined my saving would become an entitlement they would take for granted. I also learned about pride. My children grew into people who shopped at nicer stores and started making excuses about who they were and what they deserved. Sarah married Mark, who wore crisp shirts and had a way of smoothing any awkwardness at parties with a corporate smile. Emily took to weekends of yoga and brunches with influencers who liked photos more than people. I was proud in the way parents are proud, but there was a creeping feeling too. A small voice that said, "You are working to provide them comfort they will not acknowledge." I kept the receipts and the bank statements, and I wrote down dates of payments into a ledger that smelled faintly of oil and coffee. That ledger became the spine of my proof. I will show you part of it during this story because I want the facts to speak as loudly as the hurt. My loss was not sudden, it was accumulative. There were invitations unanswered, phone calls left ringing, dinners postponed with the kind of apologies that felt rehearsed. The house by the lake began as a place of laughter and later became a place they assumed would always be there. When they told me they were too busy for my birthday, an idea sat up inside my chest and looked at me plainly. I could keep being the quiet provider who fades away into convenience, or I could use what I had built to demand a sliver of dignity. That choice is what set everything in motion. The confrontation at home where everything broke was sharp and slow at the same time. It was meant to be a small family dinner with candlelight and cheap wine, the sort of thing I had saved for months to do. I lit the candles. The aroma of simmered tomatoes filled the kitchen and the pan sizzled on the stove. My neighbor Tom knocked and brought over a loaf of bread, his hands still smelling of sawdust. Sarah arrived 20 minutes late with Mark, who had on a suit that cost more than my toolbox. Emily was in a silk blouse and laughed too loud at a joke I did not hear. The table had mismatched plates I had collected from thrift stores and a linen I ironed until the collar softened. I wanted nothing more than their presence. The conversation unraveled fast. "Happy birthday, Dad," said Emily, smiling with practiced brightness. "Thank you for coming," I said, feeling the warmth of the room and the ache in my chest. "It's just a quick bite," Mark said, glancing at his watch and the glass that looked new in his hand. "Why quick?" I asked. "It's my birthday. We plan to have this together." "We are all busy," Sarah said, stirring her soup as if stirring could change the news. "You are always busy," I said, and the edge in my voice surprised me. "You are too busy to call, too busy to visit, too busy to help when I am fixing things." "That is not fair," Sarah replied, her jaw tightening. "You make it sound like we hate you." "I made the down payment on the lake house so you could have summers," I said, and I could feel my throat tighten. "I paid taxes for years. I paid for the repairs when the roof leaked. I drove up on weekends with groceries and paint." "Everything you did was for us," Emily said, voice softer now, but still distant. "But we have lives, Dad. We have plans." "Plans that do not include me?" I said. "Is that what you mean?" Mark set his fork down, the clink sharp against the plate. "We are establishing priorities," he said, in a tone that tried to be diplomatic. "Priorities?" I repeated. The lemon cleaning smell filled my nostrils, and the wine tasted metallic. "You call family not coming to their father's birthday priorities?" "We are creating boundaries," Sarah said, trying on the language of adults who have advisors. "It is healthier for all of us." "I spent weekends fixing that house so you could enjoy it," I said, "and now you use language to push me away?" "Maybe you do not understand how we feel," Emily said. "Maybe you hold on too tightly. Maybe you do not understand how it is to give up so much for a promise that becomes an expectation," I shot back. The room hummed with the refrigerator and a song playing faintly from Sarah's phone. Tom shifted on his chair, uncomfortable. He mouthed sorry at me, but did not speak. "Why are you being dramatic?" Mark said. "No one is trying to humiliate you." "Then stop humiliating me with excuses," I said, and my voice cracked. "If you are too busy for one dinner, then you are too busy for the house too." "What do you mean by that?" Sarah whispered, panic threading her words. "I mean I am not going to continue paying as if your entitlement is a contract I signed willingly," I said. "I will be making a call tomorrow that will change the status of that property." "How could you?" Emily said, surprise and a note of betrayal. "That is insane, Dad." "It is not insane," I said. "It is necessary." After that night, I sat with the ledger and the shoebox and counted out the months of payments. I checked bank timestamps and screen captured an old transfer confirmation where my name appeared as payer for the maintenance agreement. I called the bank and spoke to Lisa from customer service, who had known me for years because I always asked for the same banker. I told her to put a hold on the automatic escrow transfer. She hesitated and asked, "Is this because of a dispute?" I said, "Yes, I am changing how I allocate funds." She asked for confirmation, and I sent over a scanned letter that referenced the exact mortgage account and included copies of the receipts I had kept. I also called Javier, the realtor, who had managed the rental, and told him I was terminating the management agreement and would not renew the short-term rental status. Javier said, "Are you sure? You will lose bookings and there may be a penalty." I said, "I am sure. I want control back." I printed out the certified mail tracking number and dropped the letters at the post office, the kind where the mail clerk stamped my envelopes and looked at me with a little sympathy that felt like an extra weight. That night, I burned the final physical envelope with my initials in the metal sink and watched the paper curl into black. The smell of burnt ink mixed with lemon cleaner and the rising heat felt like a promise. I kept copies, photographed, time-stamped, and saved to a secure folder labeled Evidence. The trajectory of my sacrifice was always financial and emotional. I had given up small luxuries, taken on extra hours, and carried repair projects so the kids could have memories. I will be honest here and tell you the numbers because facts matter. Over 8 years, I paid an extra $15,000 into the house for improvements and taxes. My ledger shows transfers of $300 to $500 per month labeled Lake House Maintenance. The mortgage account shows I paid an extra $2,000 last year after the furnace failed. I have email chains with Mark where he thanked me for fixing the dock. These are not dramatic claims. These are receipts and messages that show how hands-on I was. When those gestures were met with distance and a new set of priorities, it felt like theft, not of money, but of worth. That sense pushed me from hurt to action. I reached out to Aunt Rose and Marcus, who had been friends of the family for decades. Aunt Rose sent a text that said, "You do not owe anyone patience that costs you your dignity." Marcus called and said, "If you are doing this for attention, you should not." If back that they would review the account. I also gave copies to Javier the realtor who, begrudgingly at first, agreed to withhold any further bookings until the legal status was clarified. He said, "People will talk, but the facts stand." The bait was set. I invited a handful of people to a weekend gathering at the town hall kitchen where community members sometimes meet to discuss maintenance in the Lakeside District. It was a safe public space. I arranged for Marcus and Aunt Rose to speak and for Tom to introduce the ledger as a demonstration of civic care rather than a personal vendetta. I sent a brief press-style note to a local blogger named Helen who has a small audience and likes stories about ordinary people standing up to socially polished bullies. I wrote the note plainly and attached copies of the receipts and the inspection photos. The idea was not to shame them privately, but to show a pattern in a public forum where neighbors could see the consequences of neglect. The confrontation in public was surgical and cold, and it unfolded in a small hall where the light was flat and the chairs smelt faintly of lemon cleaning solution. I walked in carrying my binder and the printed bank transfers and sat in the front row. Mark and Sarah did not expect me to be there, and they certainly did not expect the copies of the ledger on every seat. Helen arrived and set her phone up to record in a neutral corner. I began by speaking slowly. My voice was steady, precise. "I have come today to talk about responsibility and mutual care," I said. I laid out the timeline, the transfers, the inspection photos. I described the extra $15,000 I had put into the property over 8 years, and I passed the binder down the rows. The room was a plain rectangle with a clock that ticked like a metronome and the faint smell of coffee. People flipped through pages and murmured. Aunt Rose spoke about how family obligations are not a blanket to be thrown off when convenient. Marcus commented on the legalities and how one citizen can restore fairness by showing documents. Tom, who had worked with me on the porch, stood up and said, "He did the work. I saw him there for years." That moment was small, but it made faces turn. Then Mark stood to speak. "This is a private matter," he said, and the word private landed like a shield. He tried to use that shield to deflect the specifics. I had anticipated this and produced an email where he had thanked me for replacing the dock light. The audience could see the mismatch between gratitude and action. A neighbor named Helen, who is sharp and not afraid to speak, asked, "If someone invests their time and money into something for the benefit of family and it becomes taken for granted, who pays the bill?" The question made a hush. Sarah tried to cry, but it came out as a dry throat. "We never meant to hurt you," she said, and the sincerity felt rehearsed. I replied, "Meaning is not the same as responsibility." I then placed a certified letter on the table that contained the termination of my management arrangements and a formal notice that automatic contributions had ceased. The sound of the paper on the plastic table was louder than I expected. Someone snapped a photo, and it moved faster than any private text ever could. The crowd reacted in small waves. Some people nodded, recognizing the principle. Others whispered about family drama. Helen put the live video up almost immediately, and within hours, the local blog had a post with the headline that suggested a grown children conflict boiled over into public property dispute. Comments ranged from pity to admiration. The key moment came when a longtime friend of the family, Mrs. Klein, now a widow who had seen more than most, stood up and said, "He saved that house so her children could have summers. He did not raise a monument for himself. He raised a place for them. That matters." The sentiment shifted the room. Mark left early. Sarah walked out in tears. The humiliation had reversed. They had counted on private disdain, but the facts had made it public. There were moments of high tension that I will hold here for a little longer because decisions live inside them. One of those moments came the morning the eviction notice arrived at the lake house mailbox after the management terminated rentals due to lack of upkeep. I woke early and drove up, the car heater cutting through the chill and the scent of pine sharp around the road. The notice was placed neatly on the door, and the lock had a sticker from code compliance. I stood there with the envelope in hand, and a wave of old memories washed through me. I remembered painting the railing with my wife, watching the kids run barefoot. My hands felt like they were wrapped in old rope. I could have torn up the notice and driven it to the town hall like a champion of emotion, but instead I photographed it, scanned it, and added it to the binder. The act of recording was the act of self-control. It made the moment about evidence, not spectacle. Another tense sequence played out when my son James confronted Mark at a bakery where he works. The bakery smelled of warm bread and butter and the chatter of regulars. James said, "How can you talk about boundaries when you treat Dad like an obligation to be fulfilled?" Mark replied with a corporate calm, "It is about growth." James, with flour on his hands, said, "Growth does not mean you take what you did not earn." The exchange was brief, but it showed that alliances were shifting. It taught me that dignity can be reconstituted, not through fury, but through small, steady truths that people smell like bread and know to be real. After the public exposure, there were consequences, both immediate and slow. The local blog piece created enough noise that Mark's company HR team received a complaint about his conduct at family events and asked him to explain the public narrative. Sarah received messages from old friends who expressed confusion and concern. The management company issued a notice of default to the account because the escrow funding had been canceled, and they began to calculate late fees. Those numbers looked cold printed on a page, but they had moral heat to them. I received an email from Lisa at the bank saying they needed clarification, but that the documentation was in order and would prompt an internal review. It meant that the automatic payments were paused while the bank verified the changes. Javier, the realtor, called to say that the bookings had been cancelable and that fewer people would come without the short-term rental listings active. He said, "You did the responsible thing in the end. You made them remember that the property is not an entitlement." A neighbor named Paul offered me casual condolences and a jar of his homemade jam. A month passed, and I measured consequences in small wins and careful repairs to my own life. 1 month later, I could buy groceries without that edge of calculation I had lived with. 3 months later, the bank concluded their review and formally acknowledged the change in funding status and began to process arrears notices to the account that had been carried by me personally. 6 months later, a legal mediation letter arrived asking if reconciliation was possible and proposing a plan if the kids wanted to contribute to catching up on missed maintenance and begin a new agreement that was written down and signed. I did not accept on the first ask. Respect cannot be a draft. If my children wanted to rebuild ties, they would have to do it with intent and with a ledger open where everyone can see the entries. There was a moment with Sarah one evening, 3 months after the confrontation, where she came to my front porch and the night smelled like rain and roasted coffee. She stood under the porch light, small and hesitant. She said, "I did not realize." I said, "Realizing after the bills are late does not fix the months of silence." She put her hand to her mouth as if to hold back a storm and then said, "We can talk. I am sorry." I told her, If you want to come back into my life, there are conditions. It is about respect and about you recognizing what was given and what you can give back. Otherwise, boundaries exist for a reason. She cried, and we spoke for a long time. It was not a full repair. It was the beginning of one. In the wake of everything, my life changed in ways that were quiet and necessary. Financially, I reclaimed the power to decide how my money is used. Socially, I regained a sense of dignity that felt like a slow inhalation after long breath holding. Emily reached out months later, offering to pay into a maintenance fund, and we set up a written agreement outlining contributions and responsibilities. Mark emailed a terse note that acknowledged his part and asked for mediation, which we scheduled with a lawyer that Aunt Rose recommended. The lawyer, Janet, read the ledger and told us all plainly that clear agreements prevent future harm. There was also backlash. Some people in our social circle called me petty. A few mutual friends unfriended me on social platforms. But others sent notes, like Mrs. Klein, who wrote, "You taught me that the simplest acts of care deserve to be recognized." The public blog post remained online, and the comments section contained a mixture of scorn and support. The most meaningful consequence was a small integer on a page. The bank updated the account to show my name as responsible for changes made, and a notation that detailed the transfer cessation. That piece of paper was a form of validation that moved a private dispute into a formal record. 6 months after that night when they neglected my birthday dinner, the state of our family was not fully mended, but it was different. The house by the lake stands with a faded paint patch I have been fixing in spare hours. I go there now on weekends, and sometimes lighter people come by for a cup of coffee. I have new routines. I meet for breakfast with James on Sundays at the bakery, where the smell of yeast is honest and comforting. I joined a community woodworking group where I teach others to refinish furniture. Financially, I am not wealthy. I still check my accounts and balance priorities. But I have a binder that says what I did and when, and a new contract that lays out expectations if the children want to use the property. If they want to re-enter those springs and summers, it will be with commitments written and signatures in ink. There is a moral I will leave you with, and a caution. If you give without boundaries, it becomes invisible. If you document your giving, you transform kindness into something recognized and visible. If my children wish to re-enter my life fully, it would have to be built with transparency and not assumptions. If my son James wanted to sit beside me and plan maintenance, he could. If Emily wanted to contribute to a joint account, she did. If Sarah wanted to show up without apologies and with hands ready to work, she could knock on my door and start. If Mark wanted to have any place in what I called family, then he would have to be accountable publicly and privately. The choice was returned to me for the first time in a long while, and that restored something I had forgotten to keep for myself. If you have ever been stood up by those you expected the most from, breathe out. I understand. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been let down by family, and how did you respond? Write yes or no, and a short line about what you did. Your stories help others see they are not alone, and help me choose which stories to share next. Now, if you want to continue, I will leave you with this final reflection. People will call this revenge. I call it restoration. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to hear more. Thank you for listening and for keeping your own ledgers open.